Though today I came down to announce the introduction of a bill. It's S3095. It's called the Honest Expenditure Limitation Program. That spells HELP. It's the HELP Act of 2010. Now, on February the 1st of 2010, President Obama released his fiscal year 2011 budget with a funding request of $3.8 trillion. In it, he announced a 3-year freeze of discretionary spending for all non-security related agencies at the fiscal year 2010 levels, which amounts to a total spending level of $460 billion each year for those agencies. Non-security spending is defined as all agencies except the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Department of State, and one of the national security-related agencies in the Department of Energy. The administration's Office of Management and Budget estimates that this initiative will save $250 billion over the coming decade. Now, keep in mind, that's $250 billion from where it started, which I'll address in a minute. On the surface, it gives the president the appearance of being fiscally prudent, something the American people have been demanding of their government, especially in recent months. But when I look closely at the numbers he's presented, it's clear as day why he's able to offer this spending freeze without batting an eye. For one, the discretionary spending has increased by 20% in just 2 years. Secondly, the massive $787 billion stimulus package provided substantial spending cushion for nearly every agency, making a spending freeze like the president's just inconsequential. But let's stop and look at that. We're talking about $787 billion in a stimulus bill, but we're also talking about having increased from fiscal year 08 to fiscal year 2010 by 20%. So what he's doing here is raising it 20% and then freezing it there. What he ought to do is, if he had to raise it 20%, is start bringing it down. Additionally, this spending freeze proposal does too little to improve the long-term fiscal outlet of our nation. As we all know, we know where we stand at the edge of disaster. Doug Elmendorf, who is the director of the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, recently testified about our nation's fiscal outlook before Congress. And he didn't deliver very good news. I'm going to tell you what he said. He said, last year our budget deficit was a staggering $1.4 trillion. Now, remember just a minute ago I said that if you add up all of the, well, let's say that's actually more than all of the last 6 years of the Bush administration deficits. That amounts to less than the $1.4 trillion. So he said last year our budget deficit was a staggering $1.4 trillion, which represented about 10% of our total economy. He expects 2010's deficit only slightly lower than $1.3 trillion, or 9.2% of GDP. Now, looking further out, the average deficit between now and 2020 is forecast to be $600 billion per year. Now, this is all coming from Elmendorf. This is the CBO we're talking about. Additionally, CBO estimates that the amount of debt held by the public will skyrocket to $15 trillion by 2020. Now, if it sounds like a staggering number, it's because it is. And when you consider the amount of interest that we'll be paying to China and Japan and others, it's embarrassing. $700 billion each and every year in 2020 and beyond, if we do nothing about our rising deficit levels. In other words, we just keep what we're doing right now with this administration, with the help of the Democrat legislatures on both sides of the aisle, in both houses, it's going to be $700 trillion. Now, let's do the math and put that in perspective. If $700 billion of interest were paid evenly by every household in the United States today, it would amount to more than $6,000 per household. Now, that's kind of interesting. You know, I always try to do my math. When I was fighting the effort by this administration to have a cap and trade bill, which would have been somewhere between $300 and $400 billion, whether you're talking about the McCain-Lieberman cap and trade bill of 03 or the McCain-Lieberman bill of 05 or of the bills of 08 or later on the Boxer-Sanders bill, it all amounts to, or even going back to Kyoto, it's going to cost somewhere between $300 and $400 billion. What I did was, since I don't understand when we talk about billions and trillions of dollars, what really we are talking about. And so I do my math all the time and say, how much is this going to cost my average tax-paying families in my state of Oklahoma? And it amounted to $3,100 a year. This would have been if they had been successful in passing a cap-and-trade bill. It's all dead now. They're not going to do it. I don't care what Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator John Kerry say. It's history now. People are not going to pay that kind of thing to get nothing for it. Well, back in this, when we were talking about the $700 billion interest that are paid every year. Now, that's what is going to happen by 2020 with this administration if we let it continue. That would cost each tax-paying family in the United States of America $6,000 per household, each and every year after 2020. And put another way, the entire financial industry bailout. Remember the famous bank bailout? I know Republicans were partially responsible for that too. That happened. That vote took place in here in this Senate on October 1st of 2008. That's back during the Bush administration. That's back when Hank Paulson came and told everybody that he's going to save our nation. And so the Republicans bought into it. And many of my good conservative Republican friends voted for a $700 billion bailout. I did not, and a few others didn't, but the vast majority did. Now, that's kind of interesting. That $700 billion is the same figure that we're using right now that it would cost people by the year 2020, just the interest alone. But the $700 billion that we could spend on interest in 2020 happens each and every year, and we don't get anything for it. It's just the cost of living having this much debt in the first place. At this rate, it'll become more and more difficult for government to fund priorities that we truly think are important, like national security, infrastructure spending. For some reason, nobody around here wants to spend money on infrastructure. I know I get criticized because, you know, I am considered to be a conservative. I've been rated as the #1 most conservative member of the United States Senate some time ago by the American Conservative Union, by Human Events, and just last week by the National Journal. So you're looking at a conservative. But I'm a big spender in some areas. One is defending America. That's what we're supposed to be doing up here. And another is in infrastructure. We have a crumbling infrastructure system. Look what happened up in some of the bridges crumbling down. I guess that was in Minnesota, and people dying up there. Well, our infrastructure is crumbling. It's aging, and we need to do something about it. But I can't find anyone who wants to spend money on infrastructure. Instead, we're spending money again on social engineering. But to combat this, several proposals have been recently introduced that I support. In the House, Congressman Pence and Hensarling introduced a constitutional amendment that would cap the federal spending at 20% of the economy. That's kind of a 20% of GDP. It's one way of doing this. I think it's a good idea. I'm all for it. Additionally, Senator DeMint has introduced an amendment requiring a balanced federal budget. I'm all for that. I support these endeavors, to be sure. However, some of my colleagues are supporting a year-long earmark moratorium. That's kind of phony. It was reported on Monday that Speaker Pelosi has suggested a year-long earmark moratorium as well. My colleagues need to consider a couple of issues in talking about earmarks. One, an earmark moratorium does nothing to combat the increase in government spending. In other words, you have a moratorium on earmarks, it doesn't save a cent. Funding that would have been spent in earmarks will simply be spent by the Obama administration, by their bureaucrats. I suppose it should come as no surprise that Speaker Pelosi supports the Democrat administration fully funding its own priorities. Secondly, last year's earmarks accounted for only 1.5% of discretionary spending. 1.5%. Now, where's the focus on the other 98.5%? Well, where's the focus on what I call bureaucratic earmarks? Yeah, here's what happens. If you stop earmarks, if you read the Constitution, Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, it says what we are supposed to be doing here in the House and in the Senate. We're supposed to be making priorities. We're supposed to be doing the spending and watching the spending. Our founding fathers recognized that we do a better job knowing what our needs are in the local communities than the central government does. But if we let the president, in the president's budget, dictate everything, and then we try to make changes within that, and people say, oh, that's an earmark. Well, wait a minute. If you don't do that, then you're having the unelected bureaucrats in government in the Obama administration do the earmarking. So the president earmarks too. And if you don't believe it, look at the appropriations conference report, where's the focus on the vast majority of discretionary spending, which is doled out every year by bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats. I wish more people would understand this, because I find that a lot of the people that hammer and demagogue the earmark mantra are the ones who are the biggest spenders. And it's a nice way of deviating from your behavior. I think something needs to be done immediately and seriously. Today, I'm introducing the HELP Act, as I mentioned. It's called the Honest Expenditure Limitation Program, the Act of 2010. Now, the bill does three things. One, it places caps on non-security discretionary spending, which I define exactly as President Obama's budget does. I do this because I want to show the similarities between what he said he wants to do and what I really want to do. The second thing, it enforces the caps by sequestering any spending above the cap through across-the-board cuts, a process that currently applies to mandatory spending, but not to discretionary. And three, it disallows Congress from evading the sequestration cuts through a 67-vote point of order against any attempt to exempt new spending from this legislation. That's going to make it pretty tough to get through. Now, rather than simply freezing the spending, as the president wants to do, at the 2010 levels, let's keep in mind, first of all, he increased discretionary spending for a year by 20%, then he wants to freeze it there. But instead of doing that for 3 years and then allowing spending to explode again, which is what his proposal does, my bill will actually cut discretionary spending for non-security agencies, the same exemptions that he has, back to fiscal 08 levels. So it's cutting him back by 20% of what he tries to do, of about $400 billion a year. Spending would then be frozen there for 5 years, not 3 years, but 5 years, through 2020. So rather than simply freezing spending levels for only 3 years and at artificially high level, as the president's proposal does, my initiative would hold that federal government more accountable for the next 10 years by creating real, meaningful spending cuts and then placing the cap at reduced levels. The difference in savings between my plan and President Obama's plan is clearly displayed on this chart. If you look at the chart, the blue bars represent how non-security related discretionary spending levels will rise over the next 10 years if allowed to increase according to OMB's numbers. These are their numbers. The red line illustrates the impact of Obama's plan and what we will have if spending is allowed to increase following the 3-year freezing on the estimates of OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. They're nonpartisan, by the way, and they're very accurate. Clearly, the $250 billion in savings is not substantial when spread over a 10-year period. It really doesn't tighten the belt at all. My proposal is represented in the green bars. The green bars right here. This is the spending levels, and watch how they go down over the period of time from 2010 to 2020. We phased down the spending levels from their high point in 2010 to a more reasonable level between 2011 and 2015, then stay flat thereafter. My plan, when compared to the blue bars of doing nothing, if you just don't do anything at all, will save more than $880 billion over the next 10 years. Let me say that again. By reducing non-security discretionary spending levels using the same definition of non-security as the president's using, to 08 levels, and then holding them there for through 2020, our nation can save nearly $1 trillion. And when I compare my plan directly with President Obama's, my plan saves $634 billion more than his. I've made my estimates using the methodologies of the Obama administration of the Office of Management and Budget, and they are probably conservative. First off, if you look at the history of discretionary spending, annual increases are far greater than what they assume that they are here. Secondly, we don't estimate how much we'd be saving in interest by not having to borrow the spending that we're cutting. So overall, this proposal will likely save much more than the nearly $1 trillion that we estimate here. Now, if we do nothing to curtail skyrocketing government spending or merely freeze it at an artificially high, elevated level for a few years, as the Obama administration is trying to do, we will find ourselves in a tragic situation. The clock is ticking. Congress is going to have to act. Now, some of my colleagues will probably attack this proposal because the hardest thing to do around here is cut spending. Without cutting spending, we only leave one alternative, and that is massively raising taxes. And that is not what the American people want, and not what would harm our economic recovery. You know, around these halls here, we seem to forget. Most of the members of the Senate have forgotten what happened last August during the August recess when they had all the tea parties out there. And people were yelling and screaming and wanting to get involved. People are getting involved in government that never have, in politics, never have been involved before. And they were concerned primarily about two things. That was at that time, it was the government-run health care. And the second thing was cap and trade, which would have been the largest tax increase in the history of this country. But you know, right now, the Obama administration is saying, I don't care what anybody says, we're going to stay with it, we're going to be tough, we're going to have this government-run health care system, and we're going to bring back cap and trade. And just completely forgotten what happened. And I have to agree with Senator McConnell. I said, I just hope that people remember that all the way through the election, because that's what's going to have a repeat of what I remember in 1994. Others may charge that this proposal will harm the government's ability to keep citizens in the time of need, but what's important to realize about this spending reduction is that it will have no impact on mandatory spending programs like unemployment benefits, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Those programs are in need of reform, but this bill doesn't do it. This only affects the agencies identified by the President Obama's as non-security. My budget, the HELP Act of 2010, would take President Obama's proposed spending freeze and make it truly impactful. Rather than merely freezing the spending at an inflated 20% increase of the 2010 level, this will bring it back down to 2008. I think this can be done. I really do believe that the American people are going to start getting involved in this stuff. They haven't forgotten. I was down giving a speech in Florida. A bunch of people. This was is actually a Club for Growth. This particular group was, and they're a group that's concerned about spending. And I told them some of the things that we could be doing, some of the things to watch out for. Watch out for those that say that you can have a moratorium on earmarks and somehow affect. You know, if you affected all of that, it would be something like 1.5%. This bill that I have affects the other 98.5%. This is the spending. We're going to have to do it right now. If we wait, and each month that goes by, as I said, the budget that he increased in his deficit was as much as the last 6 entire years of the Bush administration. So this is the HELP Act. It's one that will work, and it's one that's come along at the right time. Now's the time to act. With that, Mr. President, I will yield the floor, and I'll suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.